Okay, only 10 more presents to wrap. You're almost at the finish line. But first... There, the last one. Enjoy a Coca-Cola for a pause that refreshes.
From writer-director Rian Johnson.
The Holy Grail. A perfectly impossible crime.
Wake Up Dead Man has critics singing its praises.
God help me. Anything else?
It's a deliciously entertaining mystery.
That's nice.
It's certified fresh.
It's a miracle.
Okay, you're freaking me out now.
It's the best Knives Out movie yet.
This case is solvable, right?
Oh, you'll see. It's fun.
Wake Up Dead Man, a Knives Out mystery starring Daniel Craig. Now playing on Netflix.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku. And it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Being a sports fan in America isn't just about gathering around the TV on Sundays anymore. Now it's about juggling your wallet and multiple streaming apps and still not being able to watch the game that you want. Between subscription fees, regional blackouts, and skyrocketing prices for tickets, parking, and concessions, the cost of following your favorite team has ballooned into a line item that can rival a small vacation. Last June, journalist Joon Lee pointed this out in his New York Times guest essay called $4,785. That's how much it costs to be a sports fan now. The piece caught immediate attention and sparked a long overdue conversation across sports media. Fans already knew that prices were high, but by crunching the numbers from a fan's point of view, Joon made the problem impossible to ignore.
In 2024, Veronica not only pays for cable and league packages, but every single streaming service. On top of that, she pays for high-speed internet. If everything else stays the same, Veronica now pays $4,784 per year to watch sports.
And it's not as if no one else had noticed. During a Senate hearing in May, Senator Ted Cruz asked the leagues, why does it seem to be getting harder and more expensive to just watch the game? He argued that leagues have an obligation to fans, especially given decades of public support from antitrust protections to publicly financed stadiums. New York City's mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani has also been blunt about what's happening inside the stadiums. Speaking to Front Office Sports ahead of his mayoral election, he had criticized dynamic and resale pricing as a form of price gouging, arguing that it's systematically pushing working-class fans out of live sports altogether.
One of my favorite memories growing up in New York City was going to the qualifiers with a bunch of my friends and just watching incredible tennis for free. And yet, for so many, the prospect of even just being a spectator, it's completely out of reach.
Yet despite bipartisan frustration, no concrete legislation has followed. And that's why Joon's piece landed the way that it did. Its clear, data-backed case shifted the conversation from league profits to access, community, and who gets left outside the stadium gates. Hey everyone, it's Kavida Davidson, and welcome to another episode of Sportly. So in this episode, I'm sitting down with Joon Lee, former ESPN and Bleacher Report reporter, now an independent sports journalist with a rapidly growing YouTube audience. I talked to him about his excellent op-eds, including a second one in the New York Times on sports gambling, but we also discussed the new kind of sports journalism that's emerging from independent media.
I want to show you something. This is LeBron James sitting courtside next to someone using StreamEast, one of the most popular illegal sports streaming sites. This is me stepping in to hit against MLB veteran Adam Ottavino. From 1990 to 2023, 45 NBA players tore their Achilles. And somehow, NASCAR agreed to let me drive a race car. The real reason fake jerseys are blowing up isn't just about the price. LeBron is a billionaire, and if he's pirating games, something's clearly broken.
And hello, Joon. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. It's good to talk to you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
So we know that dedicated sports fans in America are being priced out of their fandoms, and I wanted to talk to you about your op-ed on it. But before that, listen, you and I are two ESPN alums. I left in 2018. You were laid off in 2023. I kind of just wanted to start this conversation by talking to you about what it's like to be an ex-ESPNer, what that departure was like for you. You spoke very candidly on your YouTube page about what it was like to be laid off. You weren't allowed to do any kind of media or write or do TV for 2 years after that. And I'm wondering what your feelings on kind of that were in the immediacy of you leaving the mothership.
Ooh, that's an interesting way to phrase it. In some ways, I resonate with that statement. In other ways, I think that the industry has changed. And I think that the place that ESPN has in sports culture has become decentralized in a way that it wasn't even like 5 years ago. I think part of that is there's so many places that people have to watch game nows, from streaming services to, broadcast networks to ESPN, TNT, whatever. Like, there's so many places you have to watch games, and people don't get their sports news from SportsCenter only anymore. And so there's a level of, I think, credibility that I still have from just being able to say that I'm an ex-ESPNer. I remember a former colleague of ours at ESPN, he told me that when I got laid off, that for the rest of my career, ex-ESPN is going to be, whenever I get written about or people talk about me in some capacity, that will be in part how I'm framed as like a sports media person. And I hadn't actually thought about it that way leading up to that moment, but it makes a lot of sense because, for people like over the age of like 40 years old, ESPN is like the defining sports media brand. And it was so central to the way we consume sports for such a long time. I think in my experience in the 8 months that I've been back now, I've been a little actually surprised at how much access I've been able to just like maintain. I've heard folks from, previous ESPN layoffs that calls don't get returned as quickly, all that kind of stuff. And there's some people where I feel that dynamic a little bit. At the same time, I just had Jimmie Johnson on my YouTube channel who was, helping me learn how to drive a NASCAR. NASCAR was the group that reached out to me. I didn't reach out to them for that video. And, I was just at the MLB winter meetings last week, and all the same people who talked to me before are still talking to me now and are still just as candid as honest. And so, I hope that's a reflection of just I don't think I ever tried to peg my own personal identity and at times, self-worth, I guess, to a certain degree, professionally, onto just being at ESPN. I really tried to develop relationships from a perspective of developing trust in a specific way and really getting to know people in a specific way. And, I hope that the access that I still do have is a reflection of that. But at the same time, I think I would be deluding myself and probably gassing on my own ego too much to say that. I think it's also just a reflection of the industry changing right now. And, people who are under the age of 30 don't view ESPN in the same way that I did growing up. And so I think that it's a reflection of a lot of different dynamics that are shifting. I hope part of that is just my own professionalism and my own credibility and how I carry myself when I go about doing my job. But I think that a lot of it also has to do with just the way that people are consuming sports media differently now than they used to.
Well, that is the perfect segue to talk about your first op-ed that you wrote a few months ago for the New York Times. And it was about the affordability and accessibility of sports. And you wrote very in depth about how the streaming wars in particular have contributed to the fact that sports are more financially inaccessible than they've kind of ever been. It feels like, everyone always complains about how much it costs to take a family of four to the movies, but take a family of four to a Knicks or a Celtics game and you're out $1,000 essentially, right? Can you just summarize for our listeners what your argument is about what has led to this moment of sports being so expensive for the average fan?
Yeah, I think a lot of it ties to the collapse of the cable bundle and sports fans not watching TV as much, I would say, in the period of between 2012 and 2017, 2018. There was a lot of panic among the sports leagues about the ratings falling and young people not watching sports as much as they used to. I think as a result of all of that, the leagues just were trying to get creative about how to find a way to bring young fans back to watching sports. And, I think that part of it is that, we've seen these companies trying to save their bundle by tying themselves to sports, which is one of the last things that people will turn on a television live for and tune in to watch, and will bring in advertising money in a specific way. And I think on top of that, we've now seen kind of the splintering of what sports actually cost to watch within the cable bundle, because for such a long time, non-sports fans were helping subsidize sports fans in watching their games. And now that cable is kind of split across a bunch of different streaming services, that cost almost entirely now falls onto sports fans. And so when people see, $30 a month for the ESPN streaming service, ESPN always cost that much in the cable bundle, but it was also subsidized by people who never watched ESPN at all. A lot of that also has to do with just the rise of streaming. And I remember when I was in high school, Netflix became the big streaming service among, people I was going to school with, and you could suddenly watch everything on demand. And this was around the time House of Cards was coming out and Breaking Bad was blowing up. And we were kind of the first generation, I think, that kind of changed our TV watching habits. And we kind of saw a domino effect after that, where, as we got older, became part of the class of people who advertisers are primarily targeting. We saw kind of a shift in how the league strategies were moving towards these streaming services. And we're now in a place where these leagues are trying to reach people where they're at. There's a lot more people who are watching streaming services now. And so, but at the same time, they're still trying to reach the people who are still watching cable and still watching sports on broadcast. And so we now have games across 8 different streaming services and broadcast networks. And I think we're in the middle of this transition phase, because we're going to end up in a place where there's a lot more games on streaming and probably broadcast networks because they're free to air, and less so on cable networks at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. But because we're in this kind of in-between transition era, the cost of all of this ends up falling onto the consumer.
And with the costs falling onto the consumer, you also wrote about something that I think a lot of us have felt, even if the average fan hasn't really dissected it the way that you and I might as journalists, but the loss of community, the idea that you have to be of a certain level of wealth and class and privilege in order to actually be in the room, essentially, or be at the arena or at the stadium. You wrote about, watching the 2013 ALCS with your dad at Fenway, and that your dad doesn't watch games anymore because he won't pay the monthly fee. And that ticket to the ALCS at Fenway in 2013 is probably $100 more a person. You also wrote about something that I've been thinking about, which is that teams and leagues have always kind of understood that they need to maintain long-term fan loyalty and affinity, and the community is the way to do that in order for the success of their business. But now with private equity getting into everything and, kind of short-term returns being prioritized over everything else, it feels like maybe sometimes these teams and leagues think they're too big to fail and they don't need the community behind them. I'm wondering your thoughts on the community dynamics there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on here. So a lot of people talk about the death of monoculture. Sports is one of the last things, in theory, that can give America a sense of monoculture within the country. And it is one of those things that can be a monoculture because it's totally based off of real events. It's stuff that's happening in front of us. And I feel like the only moments we see these kinds of things now is in sports, and when big political moments happen in our country, like the Charlie Kirk assassination. That's a thing that happened in real life, and everyone is facing, in theory, the same reality. How people respond to that reality and what kind of facts they consume off of that reality is a whole different story. But this is kind of downstream from where everything is from a streaming perspective, because when sports is potentially this unifier in terms of people just getting on the same page of saying this thing happened, right? Which is not necessarily a given anymore. When you look at the country from that point of view, and then it's now paywalled to an extreme degree in the way that it is through streaming services, and beyond that, local journalism. I love reading The Athletic. The Athletic is paywalled. ESPN is no longer paywalled, but was paywalled for a while until relatively recently. A lot of really good sports coverage today is paywalled. And so, there's just not as much stuff that people have the same information to talk about and agree on and just have conversations about. And the role that sports has always played, at least for me in my life, is that, I have friends who have certain political beliefs, and there are people I know in my life who have very different political beliefs than I do. And sports has always been one of those conversation topics where you're able to develop trust with people across the political spectrum because you talk about sports and you have arguments about sports. And sometimes these arguments about sports are cultural. But what these arguments do, or these conversations about sports do, is they help you develop a level of trust with people so that when you do talk about stuff that, in theory has more effect on the direction of the country and, the world or whatever, you have a level of trust there that already exists because you had these conversations about sports. And I think that when you paywall people from being able to access these things, whether it's through the journalism or through the games themselves, it's a lot harder to just like small talk with people and develop that trust with people in the United States today.
I mean, that's totally fair. And I identify with what you say when it comes to using sports as kind of like an in to talking to people about other things, because now I live on the Upper East Side. Like, we've got people who don't vote the way that I vote, but, we're all going to sit around and bitch about the Giants every Sunday. And then maybe we'll start talking about Mamdani and Cuomo, and it won't come from a place of immediate antagonism because we've just been sitting around watching a game together for 3 hours. When you talk about the stratification of what people are watching or into, we've kind of always had that, right? The coastal elite tastes versus the middle of the country. I think some would argue that that's really more about cities versus rural and suburban areas than it is about geography. But I mean, I'm old enough to remember 20, 30 years ago when that was a conversation we were having about sports coverage itself, that ESPN was covering the Yankees and the Red Sox too much, and they weren't paying attention to the Cardinals or the Cubs or smaller, those aren't small markets, obviously, but smaller market teams than the coastal teams. And that has obviously shifted with a lot more access, a lot more streaming services where people who don't live in those towns can watch those games. How do you think that shift has mirrored the shift of broader culture? Because I think there are a lot of times when sports are either an complete outlier to our consumption habits with other forms of entertainment, or they are completely in line with them, but we still somehow think of them and treat them differently.
I think that it has actually gotten more extreme in that the teams that people talk about now, let's use baseball as an example. It's basically the Yankees and the Dodgers on a national level. And like, I'm a Red Sox fan. I've covered the Red Sox for a long time. People don't talk about the Red Sox nationally in the same way anymore. Part of that's on John Henry, but a lot of that, I think, is just because of the way that media coverage has shifted in the United States. And I think because there's a lot more catering towards the algorithm, which is not just catering towards baseball fans in the United States anymore. It's towards global fans. And the teams with the biggest global fan bases are the Yankees and the Dodgers. And I think that's true in the English Premier League. You see that with, Manchester United to some degree, Man City,
Arsenal.
Liverpool, Arsenal, Chelsea. Like, those are kind of the teams. And that's kind of where the media coverage is at. And it's a lot harder to find coverage of Crystal Palace if you're in the United States and you're a Crystal Palace fan, which there are many. And so we're seeing the way that the incentives of how teams are covered continuing to shift. And I think we're going to continue to see that because the leagues are trying to become more global. Everyone wants to become the Premier League in terms of like reach and global fan base. When the Dodgers spend all this money on guys like Shohei Ohtani and Yoshinobu Yamamoto and Edwin Diaz, they're not just trying to reach people in the United States, they're trying to grow their global fan base and set themselves up for not just the next few decades, but the next century. And they're thinking about these investments, not just in the short term of how much money they're spending, but hey, we're in this like unique internet age right now where there's all of these potential global fans up for grabs right now because there's much more marketing and access to American sports highlights, across the world. And as a result of that, if we spend money now and we kind of establish ourselves as the prestige champions of this moment, we're going to have a lot more fans for the next few decades. And maybe these fans have kids and they, raise their kids as Yankee fans or Dodger fans. And so I think that there is an interesting dynamic happening that is reflected across a lot of sports ownership, but also just like how teams are building strategy across their player operations departments, across their marketing departments, across the league general strategy, and how it's a chicken or the egg thing, but in many ways it's just reflective of people in the United States being more interested in global sports than they ever used to be. Soccer on the age of 35 is basically neck and neck with baseball in terms of popularity, according to some polls from Seton Hall, I believe. We're seeing this massive generational shift happen in how people actually think about sports in the United States and global fandom. And as a result of that, we're seeing the way that these teams are covered reflected in our social media algorithms, what shows up in our feeds, and what teams as a result show up on our feeds as well.
You also talked a lot in your reintroduction to your YouTube channel about how the hottest takes from the free non-paywalled outlets are going to be the ones that are served to you from your social media algorithm. And they're the ones that get the most oxygen and everything like that. And I think perhaps intentionally and definitely non-subtly, a couple of the screenshots that you added were specifically focused around Stephen A. Smith. But given that reporting does take resources, and I think you and I as journalists do understand why there are paywalls in certain instances, but can we get to a point where we kind of pull the pendulum back a little bit, where it's not necessarily the loudest, most outrageous takes that are being amplified, but the kind of coverage that, you know, you and I talk to everyday sports fans, and some people, they just want to hear about sports sometimes.
Yeah, I'm actually very optimistic about this right now. Journalism is going to be central to the growth of YouTube over the course of not just next year, but over the course of the next 5-10 years. And I've had conversations with folks over there over the course of the last few months, and they recognize how important journalism is for the future of the platform, because they're in an interesting place. Like, they're at a place where the only argument that Netflix has that they're not a monopoly and that they can buy Warner Brothers Studios is that actually YouTube is the biggest streaming service. And like,
they're not wrong.
They're not wrong. It's kind of a convincing argument, because like, there's more time spent on TV watching YouTube than it is on Netflix right now. And YouTube has, you know, birthed a lot of these like boutique media studios. Like Mr. Beast is like kind of a burgeoning corporate, you know, monster right now in terms of just like how the scale of their productions and what they're doing over there. But they're kind of in essence a boutique studio in the grand scheme of like the American media landscape currently. That is like the most extreme example of this. But, you know, I think that what gets the most attention in the media on YouTube tends to be the most sensational stuff. But there's a lot of YouTube channels in particular that have built up communities over 10, 15 years, that have tens of millions of subscribers, that don't get the flashy media headlines, but have really loyal communities that have been built up on a foundation of trust.
You and I come from a perspective where, you know, we've got respected media outlets in our resume. But for independent creators who don't have that necessarily, how do they build trust? And we're talking about this at a time when trust in these institutional media companies is at an all-time low, I think for a lot of good reasons. But at the same time, we, you know, still have some of the best reporting and the resources to do that coming out of some of these institutions. But then we also have the other side of that, which is anybody with a mic can say whatever they want. And it's harder and harder for people to discern from a media literacy standpoint what is and isn't credible. So for an independent creator coming up without kind of the resume that gives them automatic credibility, how do you build that trust with audiences?
That's a great question. The confidence that you have in your process, your fact-checking process, if you're striving to build trust and integrity in your channel or your Instagram page or your TikTok page, I think that comes across. And I think that it takes time to build that. You know, there are going to be people who chase attention and hot takes. A lot of them are going to burn out pretty quickly, because chasing that sort of social media strategy isn't necessarily the most sustainable thing in the long run. I think sometimes actually Stephen A gets unfairly kind of lumped into that, because he has a background as a journalist. And I think the thing that people actually underestimate about what Stephen A does, people just think he's just pulling stuff and trying to enrage people. He talks to people and he understands kind of where the fault lines of like conversations are around certain NBA players or certain NFL players. And he often is like one of the earlier people to say a thing that people might not be willing to say, and says in a very theatrical way so that it lands on social media in the way that it does. He's not just trying to like enrage people constantly in the sports space. And so being at ESPN actually gave me a little bit more context to that. At the same time, he is relying on like kind of the outrage cycle to feed into that, but he knows kind of the line to toe to do that. And I think that it's different than when someone is like, 20 years old in college and just trolling on the internet. I think that those two things, they might look similar on the surface, but there's actually a lot of difference in how the process gets to them saying something in publicly in that way. I think the other thing too is that creators are becoming more like journalists, and journalists are going to have to become more like creators over the course of the next few years. Like I think about Philip DeFranco all the time. He's one of the biggest news creators on the platform. He started out basically covering YouTube drama and then would sneak in some politics at the end. He was covering the Democratic National Convention in the last election cycle. And he has politicians come on his show and his podcast, and they talk seriously about politics. And if you look at the way that his like YouTube thumbnails have evolved over the years, it used to be like, it's Jake Paul versus blah, 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 blah. And like, that's the thumbnail. And then like the last 15 minutes would be like serious politics stuff. And he's talking about stuff from an actual point of view. And like, he has clearly thought about a lot of this stuff in a specific way, you know? Whereas now you see the thumbnails and it's a little bit more like serious in terms of how he's framing the news and all that stuff. And it's a little bit more emblematic of like a modern day version of like a nightly news broadcast with, you know, Tom Brokaw or Brian Williams or something like that. And so people who are going to make this their career, you have to kind of approach it in terms of just like centering trust first. Like beyond it, I think just being a good thing for journalism right now, I think it's actually a smart business decision in this current moment. Like, you know, I've been having a lot of conversations with advertisers and sponsors setting up for my own next year on the YouTube channel. And, you know, I announced on my channel that I wasn't taking gambling sponsorships. You know, we're not doing alcohol sponsorships. Like, there's a certain like kind of red lines that I have with my own personal YouTube channel in this current moment. And it's one of those things where the advertisers understand that like, I'm not just trying to like make as much money as possible in this moment. I'm trying to build something for not just like the next few years, but the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Like this is what I want to do primarily for the rest of my career is YouTube. And so how do I make sure that I'm setting myself up for success, not just in the next few years, but for years down the road?
Right. I thought it was really impactful when you said that you weren't going to be taking any gambling sponsorships, because this does kind of go into another thing I wanted to talk to you about. Your latest piece in the New York Times is about how kind of sports gambling is ruining the sports experience, or at least, you know, creating a whole lot of conflicts.
It's why I'm not going to be taking any gambling sponsorships on this YouTube channel, because I want to center trust again between me and you.
A lot of us have had these conversations for years about legalizing sports betting, behavior that was always underground, that you could bring above ground and tax and regulate in proper ways. But I think the regulate part of it hasn't been enforced, especially when, you know, I've said this for years, when we've had decades of examples in the UK and Ireland and Australia of certain things that we could have done from the get-go that we did not, to kind of prevent where we're going now. But you specifically called out in-game advertising for betting houses and the partnerships between institutional media companies and betting houses themselves. ESPN had ESPN Bet. They don't have the in-house anymore, but they are partnered. Those red lines for advertising have always existed in some way. You know, I'm old enough to remember that. The NFL still won't take any Super Bowl ads that have to do with tobacco and firearms and things like that. It feels like 5 to 10 years ago, it wouldn't even be a question about whether an ESPN or an NBC Sports would accept a partnership with a betting house. Where do you think that line started to erode?
I think it ties into the collapse of the cable bundle and TV ratings falling, and the internal research and public research saying that young people were watching sports more when they had fantasy involvement, especially daily fantasy, which was the precursor to sports gambling. If they had betting and money on the line, they were watching games. And despite the collapse of the cable bundle, sports ratings have been relatively steady and have risen a little bit over the course of the last few years. Even the studio shows, you know, that aren't tied to games have risen a bit over the last few years. Some of that's tied to how they've rewired the Nielsen ratings. But regardless, like, you know, the ratings have been able to stay steady despite people not paying for cable as much as they used to. And we're in this transition period where the leagues are really aiming for these global ambitions for everything that they want to do to become much more like the English Premier League and become a global sports fandom. And if ratings are falling, they don't have as much money, whether it's through the broadcasting deals or otherwise, to be able to make those things happen. And so we're in this transition period where, you know, in the next few years, the baseball broadcast rights are up, the NBA broadcast rights are up, the NFL broadcast rights are up, and they're going to have to renegotiate and probably go towards working with the streamers in a larger capacity over the next few years. And they need the ratings to be there in order to justify the bigger money so they can continue to raise their franchise valuations through whether it's TV ratings or just number of social media followers or whatever, try to raise their global footprint. And so it is in the best interest for the sports broadcasters to have gambling be legal in the way that it is right now. But I do think that we're starting to hit this kind of like wobbling point where more and more scandals are coming out. I think that the trust that fans have in the integrity of games across all the leagues is falling to a low that we haven't seen in a long time. And there's surveys that kind of lay out that reality. I think that it's going to have to take a couple of more scandals for it to really reach a breaking point. Perhaps someone who's like just more famous than Terry Rozier. At the same time, like the media outlets aren't covering these stories in the same way that they used to, with the same fervor that they used to. I remember growing up and watching the Tim Donaghy scandal break in the NBA. When the Donaghy scandal was covered and was happening, ESPN was covering that every single day. A lot of sports media was covering that every single day. It was kind of relentless. There has not been that kind of coverage around Emmanuel Clase and Luis Ortiz and Terry Rozier and Chauncey Billups. Like, it is a big story. People talk about the internet, but the media outlets aren't covering it in the same way that they used to. All of that, I think, kind of feeds into the money that these leagues need in order to continue to raise the valuations of their franchises.
Why do you think outlets aren't covering these stories? I mean, we obviously all got the breaking news story, and a moment that went viral was on Get Up when poor Mike Greenberg had to announce this the latest Chauncey Billups and Terry Rozier arrests as an ESPN bet chyron was going past him. The moment that went viral was when ESPN decided to take that off the air. But why do you think outlets aren't covering these stories more in depth or with the same fervor that they did the Donaghy scandal, or even I would say the Shohei Ohtani scandal?
I think it doesn't help their bottom line. If they covered it more intensely, there would be more distrust in the integrity of all the sports that they're paid to broadcast right now. And all of these networks are in this place where they're trying to keep up with streaming, and they need the money to do that. Netflix, Google, Amazon, they have so much more money than all of the traditional broadcasters. So it doesn't make any business sense to cover it, to keep them accountable. When Tim Donaghy was part of that entire, gambling scandal situation 20 years ago, ESPN was the biggest broadcaster. There wasn't competition. They didn't have anyone breathing down their necks to compete for the next broadcast rights deal for the NFL or any of the other leagues. They do now, and they're not the big dogs in town anymore. And so it makes sense for them if they want to maintain their ratings, if they want to, maintain the relationships that they have with their league partners. These are people that they're in business with. It doesn't make sense to cover them with the intensity that they did before. And so I don't even think it's necessarily like a malicious thing. People are like scheming in the back room being like, oh, we're going to do X, Y, Z. Like, I don't think it's anything like that. I think it's just look at what are these businesses incentivized to do? And that's 99% of the time probably what they're going to end up doing.
Let's talk about solutions, because in both your pieces about the cost of being a sports fan, essentially, and gambling, you do offer some solutions. So to start with gambling, one thing that you and I have mentioned a lot has been certain types of regulation that other countries like the UK and Australia do have that we don't currently have. And one major part of that is, not allowing gambling ads at certain times of day, particularly prime time, and in particular during actual game broadcasts. And obviously anyone who's watched a game in the last year knows that it's like you won't go to a commercial break without getting at least one gambling ad at all. So what do you think it takes for us in the United States to get that level of regulation that other countries do have on their gambling industry?
I think it'll take another scandal. I think it'll also take the political will to just organize. And I think that just doesn't exist right now. I think how much gambling has been normalized, partly reflective of how much the sports leagues need this money and how much the states need the tax revenue from it.
Yeah, I mean, and nobody's saying we should go back to a PASPA era, like when sports gambling was illegal. Like, we're never going to get back to that. There's not a way that that's going to happen. Like, do you see a tension between culturally how much betting is now a part of the sports experience and how much harm it is and can possibly cause, and how to find a middle ground between allowing the behavior and everything like that and not letting it get to the point where it is a public health crisis?
One of the concerns that I have is just we see more and more athletes speaking up about the type of messages that they get from fans these days about bets and money that they lost. I've had athletes tell me and show me messages about these kinds of things that fans say. I worry about the safety of an athlete at some point, just because there's a lot of threats. There's a lot of athletes out there. It's at the college level, it's at the professional level. It just feels like at some point something is going to happen in regards to just safety with one of these things. That's might be what it takes when people realize, like, have we dehumanized these athletes into like horses basically for our gambling entertainment, that's what it takes for things to change? It might be, but I don't know. I'm at a place where it's just like, you know, the Rozier scandal happened, you know, the Luis Ortiz and Manuel Clase thing happened. There's a lot of it was on prop bets. People seem to just like kind of be resigned to it right now. And I think that something more dramatic is going to have to change in order for things to change on a bigger level.
In your op-ed about sports being financially inaccessible for fans, you also offered a couple of solutions with the government getting involved in how to tamp down on these rising costs. Can you go through some of those solutions that you offered?
I would say that my personal favorite solution and the biggest one is I think that there should just be a way for the average person to access broadcast networks without having to buy an antenna. And I think that there's an app that can be made, whether it's through YouTube TV or some other streamer or some, I guess I wouldn't necessarily want the government creating tech, because every time the government has created tech, it hasn't been necessarily the best.
The government created the internet, though. We have to give like everything that we have now, right? But yeah, no, but point taken.
Like, you know, like the Obamacare website was not, you know, the greatest tech solution in the world, you know? So, you know, I think that like broadcast networks should be easy to access. Everyone should have access to them. Most people do not know that you can go out and buy an antenna and get that for free. Most people are watching internet TV. It's why fast channels are like low key one of the biggest stories in media right now, because there's a lot of people, you know, who don't want to pay for cable, and the internet TV is right there and they don't see it as any different than any of the free channels that they used to have. Why aren't, you know, NBC, ABC, CBS integrated into that? I think that just needs to be more accessible. I think that leagues also need to think more creatively about like how to make sports streaming accessible to places like bars. Like, so many friends tell me that they've had to log into a streaming service at a bar because the bar doesn't have that subscription service. That's crazy. And like, if the default assumption now from a lot of sports fans is like, oh, this is like an Apple TV game, it's not going to be on at the bar, I'm just going to stay at home, it just like kind of degrades the experience and the assumption that people have, where it's just like, oh, I can go to a bar and watch any sports game.
You didn't actually specifically write about this, but something that's been talked about a lot is particularly ticket prices. And most sports fans consume sports from the TV. The in-home experience is usually much better, especially for football, I will say, than it is to be in a stadium, unless you're literally on the 50-yard line. You know, what are your thoughts on how expensive it is to just go to a stadium or to an arena? And, you know, this was part of Zohran Mamdani's platform. This has been in the news recently with how expensive World Cup tickets are. We're not even talking about third-party sellers yet. Obviously, that market goes crazy. But even just the face value of these tickets are sometimes out of control. Why do you think that's grown at such a clip compared to other types of inflation? And is there any kind of stopping that growth as well?
It's growing because the demand for it is growing in some ways. And I think that it's reflective of owners believing that they can make more money off of it. I mean, people want to go to live events after COVID, and ticket prices are ridiculously expensive. At the same time, people are paying for it. And so like, again, this is a business decision for a lot of these like venues and organizations. Some capacities, like there's a lot of overlap between the ticket people and the people who actually own the venues and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like, it's reflective of the demand for it, and it sucks that it is like that right now. Like, I think back to the EPL again, they have these kind of guidelines to prevent ticket prices from skyrocketing in that way. And unless American leagues are willing to implement those kinds of things and fans want to speak up for that kind of thing, it's hard to see any of that changing.
Lastly, Joon, I was very jealous when I saw your video with Jimmie Johnson.
I've never driven a manual car before, and somehow NASCAR agreed to let me drive a race car, a rocket that can go 200 miles an hour. And when things go wrong, they go really wrong.
Oh, no!
Oh my gosh.
As a native New Yorker who has never driven a car.
You've never driven a car?
I've literally never been behind the wheel of a car.
Wow, okay. That doesn't bode well for the apocalypse.
It really doesn't. No, I always tell people in the zombie apocalypse, use me as bait. That's totally fine. That was my purpose. But I remember when I was coming up and I was staying at the Hilton Doubletree in Bristol and we were doing rookie camp that week, Tom Janode, who had just started the magazine when I started, would give me a ride to campus every day because, I mean, I could have taken the shuttle, but he was like, I might as well give you a ride. And he had lived in Atlanta for several years and he was just dumbfounded that somebody has never driven a car, which is most people's reaction. And he was like, you should do a series where a NASCAR driver tries to teach you how to drive. And I was like, that sounds amazing and terrifying and also frustrating for whoever that driver would be. So you said NASCAR came to you with this idea. What was this experience like with Jimmie Johnson? You're obviously, I mean, listen, you can drive, but driving a NASCAR car is a different experience. What was that whole thing like?
Yeah, so I guess for context, like the first kind of video that I did after my launch on the YouTube channel was me trying to hit a major league fastball off of MLB veteran Adam Ottavino. And
native New Yorker, Park Slope, big ups.
Yes, Park Slope native. And at that point, I was just like, I want to figure out a way to keep doing this because it's fun. And I think the videos are fun and it can turn into a series in some capacity. And NASCAR reached out, I think it was in like June, and was just like, hey, we want to like bring you down for a race and you know, show you the whole experience of being at a NASCAR race. I was just like, let's hop on a call. I have a crazier idea. And they kind of knew exactly where I was going. And they said like, let's do it. Let's figure it out. We've got a whole setup. Let's make it happen. And I wanted to figure out like, okay, who's the driver that we can get for this video? And I got connected to Jimmie Johnson's team through some people I know. And I basically pitched Jimmie and his PR person, Amy, the concept of the video. And they were all in on it because it was, for me, like an opportunity, not just to like do a YouTube-y type stunt, but an opportunity to like dive into the culture of what NASCAR is like and everything it takes to get a race car on the track. And, you know, they gave me like complete VIP behind the scenes access for a race weekend in Charlotte. And they showed me their entire garage and let me interview like pretty much anyone I wanted at their facility. And I got a sense for all the machinery that makes a NASCAR just like get onto the track. And, you know, I'd never driven a manual car before and all NASCAR stock cars are manual. And so that was kind of, I think, the overarching anxiety that I had going into that week. But it was as exhilarating a thing I've ever done in my life in terms of just like, oh my God, I had no experience. I had no idea if I'm capable of doing this. And actually getting to do it was awesome. And you can get adrenaline rushes from going on roller coasters and that kind of thing. But like, it's different when you are controlling the roller coaster. Yeah, it's kind of this next level of adrenaline that I've never experienced before, and it was an experience that like I will never forget, and also I think will continue to turn into a series that is recurring on the YouTube channel.
That's awesome. Did you have any like NASCAR fandom before that? I mean, obviously just professionally, I think we've all had to be at or watch a race at some point, but like what was your interaction with NASCAR before you drove a car?
Yeah, I mean, I followed Jimmie's prime, Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, like Carl Edwards, you know, the Bushes, Dale Earnhardt, like back in the day on SportsCenter. I don't think I ever like regularly watched races, but I always knew what was happening with the playoff series. Like, so I was always following that as a kid. And then like, you know, I stopped watching SportsCenter because I went to college and the world changed. And I just kind of fell out of like finding, like knowing what was happening in NASCAR. I think a lot of people kind of went through that experience. I think it's part of why NASCAR is in the place that it is right now. And they're trying to figure out kind of their new identity in a new age. And so I haven't followed NASCAR in a big picture capacity in years. And so it was really thrilling to meet Jimmie because Jimmie is like, he's one of the GOATs. Like he's one of the most dominant athletes of his generation across any sport. And so to like be able to like pick his brain, understand like how someone who is that competitive and that great at what they do, how they kind of go about their business was a very awesome experience.
Did actually like sitting behind that wheel give you that appreciation in a way that you hadn't, like the actual athleticism that goes into this?
Yes. Yeah. 100%. My legs felt like jelly afterwards. And like, there's a lot more like core stuff than I anticipated. Like your core has to be stronger just because you're dealing with the G forces. And then like your body's constantly telling you to take your foot off the gas because like it's trying to protect you, but like you need to constantly counteract your own intuitive instincts when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I'm sure that over time, if you're driving a lot, you're able to like do that secondhand. But like, you know, I was driving on practically an empty track and my brain was freaking out. Like, you're driving next to like 30 other cars in a typical race, and you're bumping into each other, and you're going like 190 miles an hour. And I maxed out at 134, I think. So like, you're going another 65 miles an hour, and you have 30 cars around you. And like, there's a lot of things going on. Your instincts are just like firing in all cylinders that like, oh my God, you do the wrong thing, you could die.
Well, it was thrilling to watch. And again, jealous. Maybe one day I'll learn how to drive, and then that'll be step one toward that end. Well, Joon, thank you. Thank you for joining me. It's good to see you again. Good to talk to you. Tell people where they can find your stuff for me doing my best Sean Evans, Joon Lee on YouTube and everywhere else on social media. Go for it.
Yes. You can search Joon Lee on YouTube. You should be able to find my channel. I'm on Twitter at Joon Lee. I think I'm on Blue Sky as Joon. I don't really post there as much. Instagram, I'm Joon. And TikTok, I'm Joon Lee.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joon. And if I don't see you, happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you.
Thanks so much for tuning into Sportly. Tune in next week and every week after as we dive into another great story. And if you have thoughts or suggestions for a topic you'd like me to cover, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to email me at kavitha@immigrantlypod.com. And if you like what you're hearing, rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Sportly is an Immigrantly Media production. This episode was produced by Paroma Chakravarti. Our executive producer is Sadia Khan. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week and every week after for more Sportly.